The whole town told him the farm was cursed. Now he finally understands why. A lonely old veteran in a red and black flannel jacket inherited a forgotten Idaho homestead from a dying stranger he'd never met. But when his German shepherd began growling at the locked barn on the hill, they broke it open, uncovering decades of hidden letters, a family secret buried in guilt, and a threat still watching from the tree line. What they found didn't just rewrite his past. It put his future in danger. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Snow clung to the ridges outside Boise, Idaho, muffling the world under a thick white silence as night settled over the hills. Inside the weather-beaten cabin, Frank Harris, a 63-year-old veteran, with silver-streaked hair and a beard grown uneven from years of not bothering to trim it, sat hunched beside the cast-iron stove. His red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket, draped over his broad shoulders, like a relic from a different life, one marked by sand, fire, and loss. Deep creases carved across his brow, each a quiet testament to sleepless nights, spent bargaining with memories he no longer wished to name. Frank's hands were thick, calloused, and steady, but there was a faint tremor he hid by keeping them busy, splitting wood, cleaning old tools, anything that fooled the mind into believing rest was not necessary. Across the room lay Ranger, his 12-year-old German shepherd, whose coat, once a bright saddle of black and tan, had faded at the muzzle into dignified silver. Ranger possessed a body built for endurance, lean but powerful, the muscles along his shoulders still defined despite age. His left flank bore a faint scar that only careful eyes noticed the remnant of a day on foreign soil when he stepped between Frank and a blast no human could have escaped alone. Ranger had a quiet temperament, watchful, disciplined, and intensely loyal, all shaped by years of working alongside military handlers before the Army retired him. Where Frank walked, Ranger followed not as a pet, but as the last living piece of a brotherhood carved from war. Tonight, Ranger's ears twitched with alertness. His amber eyes tracked the flutter of shadows along the wooden walls as wind howled against the glass. Frank sensed the dog's tension before he even looked up. Ranger never tensed without reason. The old dog lifted his head, letting a low rumble vibrate through the floorboards. "Easy boy," Frank murmured, though a small knot tightened in his chest. Ranger's instincts had saved lives, his own included, so many times that Frank never dismissed them. But the cabin was isolated, 23 miles from town. Nobody should have been around. Nothing should have disturbed the winter silence. Then the phone rang. The shrill tone sliced through the calm with surgical precision, bouncing off every beam of the tiny cabin. Frank straightened abruptly, the movement betraying a soldier's reflexes, long past their prime but never forgotten. Hardly anyone called him. The few people who had once cared, comrades, neighbors, brief acquaintances, had eventually stopped trying. Frank had made sure of that. Silence was safer. Ranger rose instantly, hackles lifting like frost-coated thorns along his spine. The phone rang again. Louder, sharper. He reached for it with hesitation he tried to hide even from himself. "Frank Harris," he said, voice gravelly shaped by both smoke and silence. A woman answered, her voice smooth but edged with urgency. "Mr. Harris." "My name is Emily Price. I'm an attorney working out of Boise. I'm sorry to call this late." Frank frowned, the lines on his forehead deepening. Emily Price, the name meant nothing to him. "If this is about VA paperwork, I've already told the office I'm fine." The lie tasted metallic on his tongue. He had not been fine in decades. "No," Emily said quickly. "This isn't about that. It's about a patient in hospice care. His name is Samuel Grant." Frank paused. He sifted through his past with the precision of a man who had lived long enough to fear what might surface. Nothing. No Samuel Grant. No similar name. No familiar memory. "You've got the wrong number," he said. "I don't," Emily replied, her tone softening. "Mr. Grant is dying. He has only a short time left, but he's been asking for you by full name. And—" She hesitated as though weighing the strangeness herself. "He asked for your dog, a German shepherd named Ranger." The silence inside the cabin thickened instantly. Ranger stepped closer, his tail, stiff head tilted, as though he recognized the weight of his own name spoken through the phone. Frank's pulse quickened. Almost nobody knew the dog's name, and even fewer knew that Ranger had ever served. The unit had dissolved after the blast in Kandahar, scattering documents, sealing files, burying secrets under military protocol. Ranger was just the dog to almost everyone after that. How the hell would he know that, Frank asked quietly. He said he would explain, Emily answered, but he insists that he must see you tonight. Frank let out a slow breath through pursed lips, tasting the cold creeping in from the draft beneath the door. His heart drummed with painful familiarity, the rising throb of panic he had fought since his 20s. He closed his eyes for a moment, grounding himself with Ranger's steady presence as the dog pressed his flank gently against Frank's knee. "What does he want?" "He said you deserved to know the truth before he passes." Truth. Frank hated that word. Nothing good ever followed it. He glanced at the frost gathering along the window pane, remembering nights overseas when sandstorms choked out the sky, and the world shrank down to the next breath, the next step, the next thing that could kill you. "Where is he?" Frank asked. "Cedar Hollow Hospice," Emily replied. "I can text you the address. He begged us not to let him fall asleep until you arrived." Ranger barked sharply, the sound slicing through the cabin, as if warning Frank not to ignore this. The dog stared directly at him, eyes bright, shoulders tense. Frank tightened his grip on the phone. "Text me," he muttered, then lowered his voice. "We'll be there." When he hung up, the silence returned, but now it throbbed with meaning. Ranger nudged his leg again, sensing the weight dropping onto Frank's shoulders, like fresh snow collapsing from a pine branch. Frank stepped outside for air boots sinking into the powdery layer blanketing the porch. The night was bitter needles of frost slicing across his cheeks. The sky was a black canvas speckled with ice-bright stars. Ranger followed, pushing his head against Frank's hip, as if reminding him of a promise neither had spoken aloud. Frank looked out across the valley, where the moonlit snow made everything seem softer, gentler than it really was. He wasn't a man who feared danger. War had cured him of that. But he feared the past. The kind of past that came calling for you through a quiet phone line. The kind that remembered your name even when you tried to forget your own reflection. He turned back inside, packing quickly and methodically, the same way he had prepared for missions decades ago. A duffel bag, a flashlight, water. Ranger's leash unused for years but necessary tonight. Before he left, Frank paused beside the small shelf near his bed. On it lay only 2 items, a faded photograph of 4 soldiers smiling through desert dust and Ranger's old military tag. He touched the tag with a thumb rubbed raw from winter winds. He didn't take it. Somehow he knew he wouldn't need to. The past had already decided to follow him. As Ranger hopped into the passenger seat of the beaten-up truck, Frank slid behind the wheel, gripping it with more force than necessary. The engine coughed, awake its growl, shattering the stillness. He breathed out slowly as the headlights cut through the snow-flecked dark. "This is just a drive," he whispered. "Just a conversation. Then we come home." But even Ranger, with his tired yet attentive eyes, didn't believe that. And neither did Frank. Tonight, the past had spoken, and the road ahead belonged to it. Frank drove through the frozen darkness toward Boise, the old pickup's headlights slicing pale corridors, into the drifting snow. The heater wheezed like an asthmatic creature barely fighting off the cold that seeped through the doors. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, his thick winter coat catching the faint glow of the dashboard. His ears, sharp triangles of vigilance, swiveled toward every sound: a shifting branch, the distant groan of wind pushing across the mountains, the hum of tires on icy pavement. To an outside observer, Ranger might have looked like any aging German shepherd with silver frosting his muzzle. But to Frank, he was a sentinel carved by war and bound by loyalty sharper than blood. The drive was long, lonely, and carried the taste of something old rising from beneath layers Frank had spent years burying. His hands gripping the wheel were steady enough, but every few miles a tremor fluttered through them, tiny, almost invisible ruptures that betrayed the panic lurking under his ribs. Frank was a man built on scars. Scars on his hands, on his shoulder, on his psyche. Tonight all of them ached as if winter itself remembered his pain. By the time he reached Cedar Hollow Hospice, a low, warm-lit building on the edge of Boise, the snowfall had thickened into slow, heavy flakes, drifting like muted confessions. Frank parked beneath a flickering street lamp. Ranger leaped out first, landing in the snow, with a soft crunch, his nose immediately sweeping the air for scents. The hospice doors slid open with a sigh, releasing a wave of gentle heat and lavender-scented air that almost made Frank step back. Places like these carried a strange weight. He had visited too many in his youth: VA wards, rehab centers, memory clinics where men he once fought beside slowly dissolved into fragile husks of themselves. A receptionist at the front desk lifted her gaze from a clipboard. She was a slim woman in her early 30s with warm tan skin, thick black hair pinned in a tidy bun, and eyes that looked exhausted yet kind. Her name tag read Sarah Nguyen. Sarah had the soft-spoken patience of someone who had worked too long around the dying, but her posture, straight shoulders, careful hands revealed a resilience that kept her from crumbling under the emotional weight of the job. "You must be Frank Harris," she said quietly. Her voice was respectful, but not fearful. Many people became uneasy around Ranger's size, but Sarah merely regarded the dog with gentle curiosity. "Mr. Grant is awake. He's been waiting." Frank nodded stiffly and followed her through the hallway. The walls glowed with soft amber light, meant to calm patients fighting their final battles. Ranger padded beside him, ears swiveling, tail low but steady. A nurse at the far end paused in her charting to watch them pass. She was a short, round woman in her late 40s, with curly red hair, freckles across her cheeks, and a friendly but guarded smile. Her badge read Nurse Kelly Horner. She had the practiced alertness of someone who could read a patient's emotional storm before it broke. "He's been calling out for you," Nurse Kelly whispered, as they approached the door at the end of the hall, her tone carrying the kind of concern found only in those who witnessed too many last words. Room 112 was dim-lit only by a bedside lamp. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic beneath a layer of fading lavender. On the bed lay Samuel Grant, the dying farmer. His body, once likely strong from decades of lifting hay bales and working the land, had withered into a fragile frame buried beneath quilts. His skin was pale, stretched, sunken, his cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows. Sparse white hair clung stubbornly to his scalp, but his eyes, dark, sunken, burning with some fierce, stubborn flame, opened the moment Frank stepped in. Ranger moved forward instinctively, planting himself between Frank and the bed, as if bracing for whatever truth hovered in the air. Samuel's lips trembled, but the moment Ranger's shape filled his vision, a broken smile cracked across his face. "Ranger," he whispered, voice as thin as frost. The sound wasn't merely recognition, it held reverence, grief, memory, something old enough to hurt. But Frank did not know this man. He didn't recognize the lined face or the shaking hands, and yet Samuel looked at him as if he were someone long lost. Frank's instinct pushed him into a defensive quiet. "I don't know you," he said, though his voice softened despite himself. Samuel raised a trembling hand, the tendons in his arm visible beneath papery skin. "You look like her," he whispered. "Your mother. You have Claire's jaw. And her eyes when she'd had enough of my stubbornness." Frank froze. The room tilted. Ranger pressed against his leg, steadying him with familiar warmth. Frank had spent decades constructing walls around the memory of his mother, a gentle woman with tired eyes, warm hands, and a voice that cracked from overwork and too little rest. The idea that this stranger spoke her name so familiarly sliced through him. "Claire was my mother," Frank said slowly, voice scraping raw on the final word. Samuel nodded, and tears pooled in his eyes, thin and watery but heavy with years. "She was my daughter." The world thinned into a single point. Frank stepped back, breath tightening into short, sharp bursts. His heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped animal. Ranger sensed the shift and nudged him urgently, pushing his head against Frank's thigh. Sarah, standing near the door, took one step forward, cautious, ready to intervene if the panic spiraled. Frank shook his head, gripping the back of a chair until his knuckles whitened. "My mother. She didn't have family. She told me." "She told you what she believed," Samuel whispered hoarsely. "What I forced her to believe." Nurse Kelly subtly adjusted Samuel's oxygen tube, giving him a moment to gather strength. Her eyes flickered with sympathy, not just for the dying man, but for the old veteran unraveling beside the dog at his side. Samuel lifted his hand again, as if reaching for ghosts. "I turned her away, Frank. I chose pride over love. She loved a young mechanic with no money, and I couldn't accept it. I told her to leave if she chose him. And she did. With you." Frank's jaw trembled. Ranger whined softly, grounding him through the rising storm in his chest. "I hired people to follow her." Samuel continued, shame deepening the cracks in his voice. "I read her letters. I never answered. And she died thinking she had no father." Frank felt his pulse thundering in his ears. He saw sand exploding. He heard the sharp crack of distant gunfire. He smelled burning metal. Ranger pushed harder against him, demanding his attention, anchoring him to the present. "She wrote you," Frank asked, his voice barely audible. "Oh, many times," Samuel said, tears now sliding freely. "Begging for forgiveness. Begging me to meet my grandson." "I was 9, Frank murmured, voice breaking. "No one came to her funeral." Those words shattered Samuel. His face crumpled, and a painful sob rattled through his frail body. "I know," he whispered, "and it haunts me. I watched you grow up from afar, watched you go into the army, watched you come home broken. I should have reached out." Frank turned away, unable to bear the sight of the man who had shaped his mother's suffering. Sarah gently lowered her gaze, respecting the storm building within him. "Why call me now?" Frank finally asked, voice hollow. Samuel looked at him with a softness that didn't belong to pride or ownership, only regret. "Because I'm dying," he said. "And before I go, you deserve to know the truth. You are not alone, Frank. You were never alone, even when I failed you both." Ranger, standing protectively beside Frank, let out a quiet, grieving sound, as if he too understood that something irreversible had broken open. And under the warm hospice lights, surrounded by strangers who somehow knew pieces of his life he had never shared, Frank Harris, old soldier, quiet recluse, lone survivor, felt the first cracks forming in the story he had believed his entire life. Everything he thought he knew about his mother was no longer true. Morning crept into the hospice room like a pale visitor touching the edges of the blankets, before settling on Samuel Grant's still, frail form. Frank Harris stood beside the bed, his red and black buffalo plaid jacket pulled tight around his broad shoulders, as if bracing him against something colder than winter. Ranger sat pressed against his legs, silent, alert, understanding, in that uncanny way only a seasoned German shepherd could understand grief that wasn't his but echoed through the air like a fading heartbeat. Samuel's breaths had grown shallow during the night, each one a thin thread straining against the inevitable. Frank had barely slept. He had sat for hours at the foot of the bed, hands clasped, haunted by the image of his mother Claire, her soft smile, the lines of weariness etched early into her face, the way she used to hum old folk tunes while patching the knees of his childhood jeans. He wondered how different her life might have been had Samuel chosen love over pride. In those final hours, Samuel had looked at Frank, not as a stranger, not as a burden of late repentance, but as the last living remnant of a daughter he had wronged and lost. And when dawn finally broke, carrying a strange, mournful quiet, Samuel Grant released a long, soft exhale and did not take another. Nurse Kelly Horner checked his pulse with practiced gentleness, her freckled face softening as she placed a hand over Samuel's. "He passed peacefully," she said in her warm, steady tone, a voice shaped by years of guiding families through moments like this. "He waited for you." Across the room stood Emily Price, the attorney who had called Frank the night before. Emily was in her late 30s with chestnut brown hair cut neatly at her shoulders and sharp, intelligent eyes framed by simple, rectangular glasses. Her navy coat, speckled with melting snowflakes, hung open to reveal a crisp, gray sweater, and the poise of a woman accustomed to navigating tense family matters with equal parts precision and compassion. She had a reputation in Boise for handling estates where emotions outweighed finances, and her calm presence suggested she had already read the weight of the moment before speaking. "Mr. Harris," she said softly. "Samuel left instructions. He wanted me to speak to you as soon as he passed." Frank turned towards her, the grief still raw, though he fought to keep it unseen. "I don't need anything from him," he muttered. Ranger nudged his knee, sensing the strain in his voice. Emily gestured towards a manila envelope on the bedside table. "This isn't about what you need, this is about what he needed to leave behind." They moved into the small family room adjacent to the hallway. A fireplace crackled softly, filling the space with the comforting scent of burning pine. Ranger lay at Frank's feet, chin on his paws, eyes never drifting far from his owner. Emily placed the envelope on the table between them, her fingers tapping once, an unconscious sign of nerves that contrasted her usually controlled demeanor. "Samuel prepared his will 3 months ago," she began. "At that time he believed he wouldn't live long enough to reconcile with you. But he made clear provisions, all of it for you and Ranger." Frank blinked. "Ranger?" "Yes." Emily offered a faint sympathetic smile. "He insisted the dog be named in the will. He said you and Ranger were one unit, inseparable." Frank looked down at the dog, whose ears perked up at the sound of his name. Something tightened in Frank's chest, confusion tangled with a faint, reluctant tenderness. Emily unfolded the documents. "According to the will, you inherit the entirety of Grant Ranch, 210 acres of pasture, forest, edge, and structures. There's the main farmhouse, though it's old, a large red barn, a tool shed, and—" She paused, eyes scanning the page. "A western storage barn. Locked. Unopened for over 30 years. And Samuel made it clear only you may open it." Frank stiffened. Ranger lifted his head, sensing the shift. "What's in it?" Frank asked. Emily shook her head. "He didn't tell me. He only said it was something that belonged to your mother. Or to you." Frank's jaw tightened. So many years he had believed he came from nothing, belonged to nowhere but a battlefield or the inside of a bottle he'd long since given up. The idea that there was land, soil, home waiting for him felt unreal, unsettling, almost unearned. And there's something else, Emily added. A warning. Frank felt the hairs on Ranger's back lift even before she continued. Samuel told me that the sheriff in that county, Sheriff Colton Dawson, has been trying to force him to sell the land for years. There's a development group eyeing the ranch. Samuel refused every offer. Frank frowned. Never trusted lawmen much. Emily gave a small, humorless smile. Dawson isn't known for subtlety. He's in his 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, always clean-shaven, with the kind of stiff, square jaw that makes people compare him to old Western movie sheriffs. But those who know him say the shine ends at the badge. He grew up poor, had a chip on his shoulder, about wealthy landowners, got into law enforcement, and sometimes uses his authority to settle old grudges. Ranger let out a soft growl, as if he didn't need a description to know a threat when he heard one. Frank rubbed his face, exhaustion weighing him down. "I'm not keeping that land," he whispered. "I don't want anything from a man who threw my mother away." "That's exactly why he left it to you," Emily replied gently. "He said it belonged to her, and that giving it to you was the only thing he could repair." Silence stretched between them, thick enough to smother thought. After a few minutes, Frank spoke again. "What happens now?" "We notify the county, arrange the transfer, and prepare for the funeral," Emily said. He requested to be buried under the old oak tree on the ranch. The funeral took place 2 days later, beneath that very oak gnarled bare, its branches twisting into the gray sky like fingers clinging to the last shreds of winter. Snow dusted the ground, softening the edges of the gathering crowd. Locals from the nearest town, a scattering of ranchers, shopkeepers, and old friends, stood quietly, with hands folded in wool gloves. They spoke of Samuel with mixed tones, admiration for his generosity when crops failed, frustration for his stubbornness, affection for his kindness to stray animals, bewilderment at the secrets he kept. Frank stood at the edge of the group, Ranger sitting tall at his side, both solemn figures carved against the snow. Frank's face was unreadable, but inside him, memories of Claire flared like fragile embers, her loneliness, her laughter, her silence. He felt her presence beneath the oak more strongly than he had in decades. Just as the ceremony ended and people began drifting away, a black SUV rolled up the snowy drive. The vehicle stopped sharply beside the oak, and out stepped Sheriff Colton Dawson. He was exactly as Emily described, tall, imposing, dressed in a dark sheriff's coat lined with faux fur, his hat tilted with deliberate confidence. His brown hair was trimmed short, and his blue eyes held the cold calculation of a man used to getting what he wanted. A faint scar traced the left side of his jaw, a reminder of some bar fight or youthful brawl that had shaped his hardened demeanor. He offered a smile that did not reach his eyes. "You must be Frank Harris," he said, extending a gloved hand. "And this must be the famous Ranger." Ranger didn't move. His growl rolled deep in his chest like distant thunder. Dawson withdrew his hand slowly, the fake smile tightening around the edges. "Oh, shame about Samuel," he said lightly. "Good man. Stubborn as a mule, but good. Land like this shouldn't sit in the hands of someone who doesn't know how to use it." Frank's expression hardened. "I haven't decided anything about the land." Dawson's eyes gleamed. "Well, let me make it easy for you. Sell. You'll make a fortune, and you'll avoid complications." Emily stepped between them, her posture crisp. "Sheriff, this is neither the time nor place." Dawson tipped his hat, ignoring her. "Think on it, Mr. Harris. Some folks don't appreciate outsiders disrupting long-standing plans." He gave Ranger a narrow look, then climbed back into his SUV, the tires spitting snow as he sped off. Frank watched him disappear, and Ranger, sensing the storm that had just begun, pressed close to his leg. For the first time, Frank began to understand why Samuel's final warning had trembled with fear. The afternoon sky sagged low over the hills outside Boise, a heavy lid of gray pressing down on the snow-blanketed land, as though winter itself were growing impatient. Frank Harris guided the old pickup along the winding ranch road, its tires crunching through packed ice. His red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket swallowed most of his frame, but no amount of fabric could soften the sharp tension in his jaw. Ranger lay in the back seat, head resting on his paws, his alert amber eyes tracking every sway of the landscape with a soldier's vigilance. Though 12 years old with silver feathering the edges of his muzzle, he still held the presence of a warrior, lean, powerful, and always prepared. Grant Ranch spread before them as they crested a small rise, an old wooden farmhouse with weather-worn rails, a red barn huddled against the snow, like a sleeping animal. And beyond it, halfway up the hill, the western storage barn Samuel Grant had forbidden anyone to open for 30 years. The land felt abandoned and restless, as though it remembered hands that once tended it, and wondered whether this stranger in a flannel coat deserved to inherit its secrets. Frank felt the weight of every acre pressing on his chest. The wind sharpened as he stepped out, tugging at his jacket and stirring Ranger's thick fur. The dog hopped down beside him, sniffing intensely, tail low, muscles taut. Almost immediately, Ranger's ears pinned back, and he released a low growl, deep quiet, the kind that vibrated through the ground rather than the air. Frank followed Ranger's line of sight toward the tree line bordering the ranch. Something a shadow, a shift of branches moved briefly, too controlled to be wind alone. A person. Watching. Then gone. Frank's instincts tightened. Years of training taught him the difference between imagination and a threat. This was threat. He placed a steadying hand on Ranger's shoulder. Easy, boy. They approached the western barn. Its faded blue paint peeled in strips, and the old metal roof clattered against gusting winds. The large padlock on the door hung crookedly, its brass surface marred with fresh scrape marks. Someone had tried to force it open recently. Ranger sniffed the lock and let out a sharper growl, hackles lifting like quills along his spine. A sudden rustle from the trees snapped Frank's head up. Before he could react, something heavy sliced through the air, then slammed into Ranger's flank. The dog yelped in pain and collapsed sideways into the snow. Frank's world snapped. Every instinct from Kandahar surged through him. He spun toward the trees and caught sight of a tall figure in dark clothing, disappearing behind the pines. Frank charged without thought, boots pounding into the snow, breath burning against the cold. His heart hammered not with fear, but with the old terrible rage that had once made him unstoppable on battlefields. The shadowed figure moved fast, too fast. Frank followed him into the edges of the woods, branches clawing at his coat, snow flying beneath heavy steps. The man left deep footprints in the soft drifts, but after 20 yards, the trail veered into a mess of broken underbrush and overlapping animal tracks. All trace vanished. Frank cursed under his breath. Whoever it was knew the terrain, and they had wanted to hurt Ranger, not Frank. That alone made the rage claw even deeper. He turned back to the dog, who was trying to rise but failing his breaths fast and shallow. Blood mottled the snow where the stone had struck him. Frank hurried over, dropping to his knees. Ranger whimpered, leaning into Frank's touch. "It's all right," Frank whispered, though his voice trembled. "I've got you." He lifted the dog carefully into his arms, a heavy burden, but one Frank carried with a kind of desperate tenderness, and took him into the farmhouse. The interior smelled of dust, old pine, and disuse. Cobwebs clung to corners, furniture lay beneath sheets. The fireplace hadn't been lit in years. Frank placed Ranger onto an old rug near the hearth and checked the injury with gentle, steady hands. The stone had bruised the ribs, but hadn't broken them. Ranger winced, but kept still as Frank cleaned the wound. The dog pressed his nose weakly into Frank's wrist, a silent vow that he was still fighting. Frank's anger simmered beneath his skin. Someone had been watching. Someone wanted them off this land. And Frank already knew who would benefit most. Once Ranger was resting, Frank wrapped a scarf around his neck, grabbed a crowbar from the tool shed, and marched toward the western barn. The wind roared and snow began falling, not lazily, but in thick, insistent flakes. He smashed the rusted lock easily. The door groaned open, exhaling a stale breath from decades of secrets trapped inside. Dust motes swirled in the dim light. The air smelled of cedar old paper and something faintly metallic. The barn held almost nothing, just a wooden chest, a metal trunk, and a work table covered in a thin coat of frost. Frank approached the chest first. Its brass hinges creaked as he opened it, revealing stacks of bundled letters tied with faded twine. The envelopes were brittle edges, yellowed. Every one of them was addressed to Claire Harris. Frank's breath caught. His fingers trembled as he lifted a bundle, the familiar handwriting looping across the page. These letters had been meant for his mother. Apologies, explanations, confessions, and Samuel had never sent them. He opened one. "My dearest Claire, I watched you from the road today. You carried your boy on your hip. He looked strong. You looked tired. I wanted to help, but cowardice held my tongue." Frank swallowed hard, eyes stinging. Another letter described him as a teenager leaving for the army. Another described Samuel standing outside the courthouse with adoption papers in hand and turning away. Then he opened a final envelope addressed not to Claire, but to him. "Frank, I have watched you survive what should have killed you. I never earned the right to be proud of you, but I am. More than you will ever know." The barn blurred as Frank's heart clenched painfully. He felt betrayed, abandoned, furious, but also something he didn't want to name, the ache of lost family. Snow battered the roof harder. Footsteps crunched outside. Frank snapped his head up. Ranger, though injured, let out a warning bark from the farmhouse. Frank stepped outside just as a tall figure leaned against the fence, Sheriff Colton Dawson. Dawson wore his dark sheriff's coat, buttoned tight, dusted with fresh snow. His hat sat low, casting his blue eyes into shadow. A cold smile curved his mouth, controlled, practiced. "Well now," Dawson drawled, "looks like you've settled in quick." Frank's glare hardened. "Someone attacked my dog." Dawson shrugged with infuriating nonchalance. "Dogs wander. Ranch land is dangerous. Could have been a coyote." Frank stepped closer. It was a man. Dawson's smile widened, but his eyes sharpened. Land like this tends to stir trouble when it falls into unfamiliar hands. Ranger barked again, from the porch, hoarse but defiant. Dawson tipped his hat. "I'll make it simple. Sell the ranch, Harris. Otherwise—" His gaze drifted to Ranger. "Boise winters can be long. Would hate for them to turn into a nightmare for you and that old dog." Frank said nothing. His silence was promise enough. Dawson's smile faded. "Think on it." He turned boots, crunching SUV engine roaring to life as he sped away. Frank stood rooted in the snow, trembling not from the cold, but from the realization settling into his bones. This land held truths, danger, and a war he hadn't asked for, and someone was determined to chase him off. But Frank Harris had been chased before. He'd survived worse, and this time he wasn't alone. Ranger, limping but loyal, pushed his head against Frank's knee. Frank looked toward the locked barn, the letters, the shadows in the woods, and understood that whatever Samuel had tried to protect all those years was no longer hidden. Snow continued to fall over the hills outside Boise, not in the vicious, bone-cutting way it had haunted Frank Harris during winters alone in his mountain cabin, but in a gentler rhythm, soft flakes, drifting like feathers onto the now busy land of Grant Ranch. The silence of past months had been replaced with the low hum of activity, a hammer tapping wood footsteps, crunching along icy paths, the bark of Ranger mingling with the wind. For the first time in years, Frank's world held more than ghosts. It held purpose. His red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, once a symbol of solitude, now felt like a uniform for a man rebuilding himself piece by piece. Ranger was at his side again, fully recovered, except for the slight tenderness in his ribs, but any trace of weakness was overshadowed by his bright, alert eyes. He ran across the snow with renewed strength, leaving trails of scattered paw prints behind him, his heavy German shepherd frame moving with the grace of an aging warrior, reclaiming youth. The morning after Samuel's burial, Frank stood beneath the oak tree that loomed at the center of the property. Its branches were knotted with age, creaking softly in the wind, as though sharing the sigh of a soul finally at rest. Beneath it, Samuel Grant now rested in a simple, hand-carved wooden coffin. Frank had kept the ceremony small, just Emily Price and a few locals who had known Samuel in his better years. One of them was Margaret Hale, a woman in her late 60s with soft gray curls tucked beneath a knitted beanie, cheeks pink from the cold, and a kind, grandmotherly disposition. She brought warm cinnamon bread wrapped in wax paper, insisting with gentle stubbornness that no man can grieve properly on an empty stomach. Her late husband had served overseas decades before, and her empathy toward veterans ran deep, a quiet kindness shaped by personal loss. Frank liked her instantly. She treated Ranger not as a threat, but as an old soul deserving of respect. Another was David Miller, a 35-year-old rancher from a neighboring property. David was tall and sturdy with sandy brown hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and hands roughened by years of fence repairs and cattle work. Though his frame was broad, his demeanor was gentle, cautious, even like a man who knew the danger of speaking too loudly around wounded hearts. David's father had taken his own life after returning from Afghanistan, leaving David with a lifelong vow to help others avoid the same fate. When he learned that Frank was a former soldier, he began dropping by the ranch more often, always offering assistance without saying the word help directly, as though he understood that pride was something a veteran never surrendered easily. Emily continued to visit as well, driving through snowstorms with legal documents stacked in the back seat of her sedan. She wore long wool coats and leather gloves, her chestnut hair pulled behind her ears, her sharp eyes missing no detail. There was a steadiness to her that Frank had come to appreciate. She approached conflict like a chess master, anticipating Sheriff Dawson's maneuvers before he made them. Emily had once worked defense for vulnerable clients targeted by land developers. Dawson's methods were far from new territory for her. She promised Frank more than once that he wouldn't face this battle alone. In the following weeks, the threat from Dawson's shadowy influence remained, but did not escalate. Perhaps the sheriff was waiting. Perhaps he was planning. But for the moment, the ranch felt safe enough for Frank to face the truth he had avoided for decades. His mother Claire had dreamed not of wealth or escape, but of a place where broken soldiers and discarded dogs might find one another, each healing wounds the other could not speak aloud. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the snowy hills and stained the sky in shades of amber and burning gold, Frank stood outside the red barn with a wooden plank propped on a workbench. His breath misted in the air, but the cold no longer seemed hostile. It felt like a companion to hard work, something familiar he could push against. He carved each letter slowly, with a chisel, hand steady, Ranger sitting nearby as quiet witness. When he finished, he lifted the plank and hung it onto two metal hooks beside the barn door. The carved letters caught the last traces of sunlight. Grant Ridge Canine Sanctuary, a home for veterans and rescue dogs. The moment the sign clicked into place, something warm settled inside him. Not triumph, something deeper. A returning. A belonging. Word of the sanctuary spread faster than Frank expected. First appeared Tom Willis, a 48-year-old Marine veteran with a stocky build, storm-gray eyes, and a gait uneven from a blast injury in Fallujah. His dog, Shadow, a black German shepherd with a missing tail tip, stayed glued to his side like a shadow true to its name. Tom spoke in short, clipped sentences, at first an old habit from years of suppressing emotions. But the moment he saw Ranger, his eyes softened. Next came Elias Brooks, a soft-spoken 70-year-old Vietnam vet, with a hunched posture, thin gray hair, and hands that trembled slightly from age and memories he refused to share. He brought with him Amber, a golden-coated shepherd mix rescued from a shelter. Elias had once been a medic, and despite his reserved nature, he instinctively tended to the smallest injuries of every dog he met. And then there was Jenny Alvarez, a 41-year-old Army mechanic with olive-toned skin, short dark hair, and a scar slicing through her left eyebrow earned during a convoy ambush. She didn't bring a dog. She wanted to adopt one. She carried the weight of guilt around her shoulders, guilt born from losing her squad dog during a sandstorm years earlier. The sanctuary offered her something she couldn't name, maybe redemption, maybe companionship, maybe the chance to care again. Frank observed them quietly leaning against the farmhouse porch railing. Seeing these giants, men and women who had survived wars, but not always themselves, standing awkwardly in the snow, learning to laugh again, as their dogs bounded between them, felt like watching ice thaw in slow motion. Ranger, limping slightly, but determined, shepherded the newcomers like a proud host, nudging shy dogs toward hesitant owners playing referee when roughhousing grew too enthusiastic. Emily visited that afternoon, watching from the porch beside Frank. "This place is alive again," she said softly. Frank nodded, his expression subdued but warmed. "I didn't think I'd ever be part of something like this." "You didn't find it," Emily replied. "It found you." Frank looked towards the oak hill, its branches swaying in the winter twilight. He thought of Samuel, of the mistakes he carried, the apologies he wrote, the courage he found too late. The wind curled through the branches gently, almost like a sigh freed from decades of guilt. As the sun dipped, the sky blazed orange and ruby. Ranger nudged Frank's hand, and Frank placed his palm atop the dog's head, grounding himself in gratitude. For the first time since returning from combat, Frank felt his heartbeat not as an echo of missed chances or old regrets, but as something steady, something present. He whispered more to the sky than to anyone standing nearby. "Mom, I'm home, and I'm done running." Behind him, the sanctuary bustled with soft laughter and barking. Ahead of him lay a long, uncertain future. Sheriff Dawson's threat still lingered like distant thunder, but Frank now faced it with a family forged from broken pieces that fit together more perfectly than any he had known. Grant Ranch, once a place of secrets and solitude, had become a beacon of warmth in the endless Idaho winter. An unlikely home where a veteran in a flannel coat and his loyal German shepherd began stitching not just their own wounds, but the wounds of others who had wandered too long in darkness. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or bright wings in the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through an old farm buried in snow, through a loyal dog who refuses to give up, through a broken soldier learning to breathe again. And sometimes, if we're blessed, they come as a reminder that God never forgets the ones who wander the longest. Frank thought he was alone. Ranger thought he was just a survivor. But grace found them both in the most unexpected place, turning loss into belonging and an abandoned farm into a home of healing. Maybe that's the miracle waiting for each of us, that no matter how far we fall, how heavy our past becomes, or how silent our nights feel, God can still lead us to the one place we're meant to return to. A place where wounds soften, hearts mend, and the cold finally breaks. If this story touched your heart, even a little, share it with someone who might need hope today. Drop a comment below, tell us where you're watching from, or share your own story of faith, courage, or the bond with a loyal dog. Your words may be the light someone else is searching for. And if you want more stories of miracles, redemption, and the quiet ways God works through everyday people, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. May the Lord watch over you, bless your home, protect those you love, and place His gentle hand on every step you take. May His peace follow you through the storms, and may His grace find you just as it found Frank and Ranger. God bless each of you,